Welcome everyone, I'm Ruben and I'm your host for the Think Global mini-series. Now this year we're being more ambitious than ever to support you in unlocking global growth, being international fast movers and gaining a competitive advantage in new markets. Over 3 episodes we'll help you decode the business landscape, identify high value markets for growth and power up digital trade with AI. We'll also share exclusive research from The Economist Group, including an interactive map with market insights to help you make more accurate decisions. Now, we all know that the global economic landscape is dynamic and changes at pace. So the mini-series will run throughout the year. This way, we'll always bring you the latest insights and success stories. So in this first episode, we'll explore a 3-pillar framework for growth, as well as the AI-powered tools that can help you expand worldwide. Our guest speakers, Tom Standage of The Economist and Colin Murdoch from DeepMind, will also be on hand to share the insights you need to thrive amidst uncertainty. So first, to take us through the International Growth Framework, we have Eduardo Bortolato, Head of International Growth here at Google. Over to you, Eduardo.
Hi everyone. Let's face it, as Ruben was mentioning, uncertainty is a common denominator worldwide. But it's also true that the effects of uncertainty are not equally felt in all markets. And that's where the opportunities lies for your business. By diversifying, you can find high-value customers wherever they are. And in the new area of globalization, having an international presence is easier than ever, thanks to digital. 60% of the world is now online. This means that nearly 5 billion people are searching, watching videos on the web, interacting with brands, and also making online purchases. This presents a huge opportunity for businesses looking to deliver goods and services to international regions. This is a key reason why cross-border commerce has grown twice as fast as domestic over the past 5 years. And purchasing internationally has also accelerated post-pandemic, happening 25% more frequently. And as purchase options increase and economic uncertainty remains, consumers are more open than ever to trying new brands, with 1 in 4 consumers globally willing to switch between brands. This is an opportunity for you to capture more demand, but also a warning. You need to invest in your global brand or you risk other players moving in on your customers. These are precisely the reason why, despite the complex macro and geopolitical landscape, global brands remain top performance. A good example is PepsiCo. When inflation hit, they were already ahead. They have invested in their global brand and embraced innovation to optimize their international go-to-market and business setup. But if you haven't figured out your global plan yet, it's not too late. In this episode, we will help you decode the insights informing global expansion and equip you with the newest framework for global success in 2023. The framework is made up of 3 priority pillars and has been developed by our international growth consultants who help more than 2,000 advertisers expand every year. The pillars are, first, geo-diversification through digital to grow amid uncertainty. Second, building a strong international brand to untap high-value sales in global market. And finally, the third pillar, gaining efficiency and future-proofing your businesses by embracing AI. So I'll help you make sense of these 3 pillars so you can build or optimize your international plan. But I won't be alone. As Ruben mentioned, I'm very happy to share that Thomas Standage from The Economist and Colin Murdoch from DeepMind will be our guest speakers. Let's start with pillar 1, which is about gathering insights and trends to make the right decisions for your international strategy. First, you need to decide whether you should expand into new markets or optimize your presence in the current markets. These 4 factors were identified as critical by our international growth consultants: market attractiveness, product market fit, market entry barriers, and market risks. It's important that you index these indicators for every market, current or new ones, and then ask yourself, have you maxed out in your current markets? If so, you'll need to expand. Did you see potential to grow your market share in your current markets? In this case, you'll optimize for global branding. So gathering information about these factors and the trends that drive them, it's not an easy task. That's why we invited our guest, Thomas Standage, deputy editor of The Economist, to unveil the trends shaping the global business agenda in the world ahead.
Hello, I'm Tom Standage, Deputy Editor of The Economist and editor of our future-gazing annual, The World Ahead. Today I'm going to talk about 5 trends shaping the business environment right now, and what to look out for and what the arguments are going to be. We've gone from a world where the biggest thing affecting the business environment in the short term was the pandemic, and now it's the war in Ukraine. The pandemic and the war were huge, unexpected shocks that accelerated changes that were already underway. Before we get to those, let's start where the pandemic and the war overlap, something they've both contributed to: inflation. The economic outlook is pretty grim. The World Bank says we've entered a protracted period of feeble growth and elevated inflation after Russia's invasion of Ukraine magnified a slowdown in the global economy caused by the pandemic. This chart tells the story. During the pandemic, people were unable to spend as much money on services, like going on holiday, because of lockdowns, so they spent money on goods instead. And that, combined with stimulus to revive economic activity, overloaded supply chains and pushed up prices. Inflation began to pick up in late 2021, but most economists and central bankers thought it would quickly pass. The war in Ukraine put an end to that idea. It pushed up energy and food prices, boosting inflation to levels not seen for decades in many countries. That in turn prompted central banks around the world to raise interest rates dramatically. History tells us that it's very rare for central banks to stifle inflation without also causing a recession. So far, both America and Europe have avoided falling into recession. But in recent weeks, these higher interest rates have caused a series of bank failures. The worry is that banks will withdraw credit and companies will hold back on investment, triggering a recession. Whatever happens, life is difficult for companies and for consumers. Companies are looking for ways to cut costs. Consumers, squeezed by high energy prices and high food prices, have much less disposable income. So how is this changing their spending priorities? A survey last year found that international travel was the highest priority, and that consumers were prepared to cut back in other areas. Revenge tourism, taking the holidays you were denied during the pandemic, has caused a rapid rebound in the travel industry. But more generally, a big question for companies today is the extent to which consumer behaviour has been permanently altered by the pandemic. And that's our second trend. The pandemic led to huge jumps in the adoption of online shopping, online learning, and other ways of doing things remotely. In a few weeks, consumers were fast-forwarded several years into the future. But not all of these behaviours stuck when the pandemic ended. Here's a chart that shows adoption of e-commerce in Britain and America. You can see that adoption shot up, but in America it fell back to the previous trend, whereas in Britain it's remained about 2 years ahead of the trend. So we're seeing different degrees of stickiness in different places. In America, air travel has returned to its pre-pandemic level. So has restaurant dining. But spending on buying groceries online, which doubled in America at the start of the pandemic, has remained at that elevated level. Again, we see that consumers have gone back to pre-pandemic behaviour in some ways, but not in others. So which behaviours have stuck, and how does it vary by country? This chart looks at the stickiness of 6 different behaviours across multiple countries. You can see that some behaviours, like shopping for groceries online or telemedicine, have proved stickier than others, like taking classes online or cutting down on air travel. The other thing this shows you is the wide variation in stickiness between different countries for any given activity, as well as between activities. So it's dangerous to generalise about what sorts of behaviours have or have not stuck after the pandemic. It varies by country and activity, and that means companies have to make greater use of analytics to track how customers are behaving. Customers' behaviours and expectations have changed in all kinds of ways, and they're still changing, and companies need to be flexible enough to respond. These changes among consumers are dramatic, but what's even more dramatic is the change in the relationship between employers and employees as a result of the rise of remote working and hybrid working, and that's our next trend. This will probably prove to be the pandemic's most enduring legacy for businesses. It's a really big shift, as big as the shift to working in offices rather than in factories or fields. Many companies were reluctant to try working from home in the past because they worried that if it went wrong, they would lose out to rivals. They also worried about the impact on productivity. But it turns out that remote working doesn't reduce productivity and may in fact increase it. For the most part, people haven't gone fully remote, they've switched to hybrid working, dividing their time between home and office. There's still a lot of debate about what the best mix is. Many companies are having trouble getting workers to go back to the office. Bosses, in general, want people back in the office more, and workers, in general, don't want to go back to the office for quite as many days as their bosses would like. But this assumes that all workers have the same preferences, and we know they don't. Surveys from America suggest that women and people of colour are less keen on returning to the office. These disparities matter because there's a lot of evidence that managers favour workers that they see and interact with more frequently. So there's a danger that if some groups of workers go back to the office less than others, those groups will miss out on pay rises, promotions, and other opportunities. This could widen the gender pay gap and mean that companies actually go backwards on diversity and inclusion. The hybrid workplace of the future will be less fair unless it's designed not to be. And fairness is not the only thing that needs to be sorted out about hybrid working. There are arguments about taxes, the surveillance of workers, and what all this means for the design of offices. It will take years to sort all of this out, and there are no easy answers. Okay, so those were 2 trends, changes in consumer behaviour and changes in the nature of work, where the pandemic accelerated existing shifts. The same thing has happened with the war in Ukraine. It's also accelerated changes in the business environment that were happening anyway, in 2 areas in particular. The first is that growing geopolitical risk is causing companies to rethink their approach to globalization. The war led to sanctions on Russia, and lots of companies pulled out of the Russian market. This is the latest example of how businesses have to deal with unexpected geopolitical disruption. In recent years, we've had the unpredictable trade wars launched by Donald Trump. We've had efforts to limit the sale of certain technologies to China. We've seen growing concern about reliance on chip making in Taiwan. In Britain, we've had to deal with the chaos and complexities of Brexit, and so on. All this has forced companies to deal with geopolitical and regulatory uncertainty. Supply chains, which often span multiple countries, have become much more politicized. You can see all this in this chart. Risk and uncertainty around trade policy surged during the Trump presidency, and geopolitical risk spiked with the invasion of Ukraine. Similarly, restrictions on international trade have shot up as Western countries imposed sanctions on Russia. But an even bigger question is what all this means for trade with China. There's growing talk of a new Cold War between the West on the one hand and a Chinese-led bloc on the other. This would be very different from the old Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union, because there was no trade to speak of between them. But there's a huge amount of trade between the West and China. It is integral to global supply chains. The sanctions imposed on Russia have focused minds on what would happen if China invades Taiwan. Western firms are looking for ways to reduce their dependence on China, which is both a key manufacturing hub and a leading supplier of vital commodities. One approach is reshoring, where you bring manufacturing and services back to your domestic market. Another is friendshoring, where you move production away from China to countries that are deemed less risky. So does all this mean that we're heading for a less globalized world? Well, it turns out that globalization peaked in about 2009, when trade as a percentage of global GDP hit its all-time high. Today's efforts to decouple from China are sometimes characterized as deglobalization, but that's not quite right. If Apple moves production of some products from China to Vietnam or India, its supply chain is actually more globalized. So it's more like re-globalization, as companies rethink their supply chains to make them shorter and smarter. There's more emphasis on just in case rather than just in time. Running a less lean supply chain pushes up costs, but it also improves resilience. One of the things many companies learned in recent years was that they'd gone too far in optimizing their supply chains, and there was no slack at all. So any problem anywhere, like a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal, could cause disruption. Paying more attention to supply chains has other benefits too. Some companies were already doing this because investors have been pushing them to pay more attention to ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations. If you want to measure your carbon footprint or check that your suppliers are not using forced labor, you need to know what's going on in your supply chain. For years, reporting these things was voluntary, but regulators are steadily making climate impact reporting compulsory. And whether it's required by law or not, it's already something that is increasingly expected by investors and by consumers too. And that's because consumers have lost faith in governments' willingness to act on climate change and prefer to put pressure on companies directly. And that brings us to our final trend, the politicization of business. On a range of political issues, from climate action to racial justice to abortion rights to human rights in China to pulling out of Russia, companies are increasingly expected to take a stand by customers, employees, and investors. And that often brings them into conflict with politicians, customers, employees, and investors who disagree with the position that they've taken. As a result, today's CEOs have to be politicians themselves. This is a chart from the latest edition of the Edelman Trust Barometer, which looks at public attitudes towards companies, politicians, the media, and NGOs. you can see that way more people think companies should be doing more to address societal issues than think that they're already overstepping the mark. What's more, companies, amazingly, have for many years been more trusted than NGOs, governments, or the media. Now, this isn't because people suddenly trust business, it's just that they trust everyone else even less. So what's going on? Well, politicians aren't considered to be doing enough to address big societal problems. And civil society has become much more vocal and has more ways to express disapproval, for example, through social media. Consumers expect companies to fill the vacuum left by politicians' inaction or lack of trustworthiness. And they may feel that lobbying companies is the most effective way to bring about change. Also, business is the only institution that's perceived as being both ethical and competent enough to solve big problems. The upshot is that as people become more disenchanted with politicians, they expect companies to step up and take action. Okay, those are my 5 trends shaping business right now. In conclusion, I'd like to add one more thought. I'm often asked when things will go back to normal. It turns out that in retrospect, the pandemic marked the end of an unusual period of relative stability in geopolitics and economics. We had unusually low levels of inflation, interest rates, and conflict between great powers for many years. But now everything has changed. The much more unstable world we now find ourselves in, whether it's because of the unpredictability of geopolitics, economics, extreme weather, or rapid technological change, this is the new normal. It's already here, so we might as well get used to it. Thank you for listening.